Hello, Jonathan Hetterly here, and today we're going to be discussing the psychological themes found in the new Netflix original film, 22 July. Psych Cinema is Shrink Tank's video series where I review and discuss the themes found in the films that I watch and love. Before we get started, do me a favor. Subscribe to our channel and click on the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out when we put up new videos exploring the intersection of psychology and pop culture. So we're going to be discussing 22 July, which is up on Netflix now. I'm going to be exploring the themes in the film, so if you haven't seen it, do me a favor, pause this video, go watch 22 July on Netflix, then come back and watch this analysis of the film. Written and directed by Paul Greengrass of the Bourne series, as well as United 93 and Captain Phillips, 22 July depicts the real-life terrorist attack on Oslo in 2011, to where a single terrorist exploded a device in a government building, and then in the subsequent chaos posed as a police officer and went to the island of Utøya and subsequently gunned down over 60 teenagers at a youth leadership camp. This film is, I have mixed feelings about this film. And it's not just the film itself, but also the motivation of Paul Greengrass to make the film and the motive why now. On the one hand, it really captures the fear and terror, I think, of the entire nation and anybody about such a horrific type of event. There's a lot of chaos, the fear, and just sort of the different ways that people would react and respond in the face of such a horrific scene and scary incident. And I know the word scary may seem underwhelming when you're facing someone that his sole purpose is to kill you. And so the depiction of the attack on the island is horrific. It's tense, it's dramatic, it's nauseating in a lot of ways. And I think this is really one of the purposes behind the film, at least Paul Greengrass. Why else would you make a film so soon after the events, if we're talking about 7 years, unless you really wanted to capture the chaos and terror of those that survived? In fact, there's actually a second film coming out, or has already come out, depicting the attack on Utøya as well. And the other film, I believe it's called U-22, it actually is filmed in real time. The length of the film, it recreates the actual length of the attack on the island. So it's really designed to be immersive and almost like virtual reality of putting you in on the island and what it must have been like for the children that were there. And I have mixed feelings about that. On the one hand, it really, from such a desensitized and remote perspective, to read about things, to hear about things through news or YouTube. It's one thing to see on a really small screen footage of after the fact. It's another thing to see a dramatic depiction of it. It's very unsettling. But the biggest problem I have with this film, and I'm not sure if there is a way to reconcile it, is that the attack on the island, the terrorist attack of July 22nd, is roughly only about a third of the film. The remaining 2/3 of the film splits its time between the recovery and trauma of one of the central youth named Viljar, who survives even though he's shot 5 times, and just kind of his rehabilitation and the trauma and the grief and the impact it has on his family. But then the other third of the remaining film focuses on the trial of the terrorist, Anders Breivik, and it really focuses on him and his lawyer. And I have mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, this film, the 3 parts, it really is sort of a dynamic of looking at what people will do when it comes to following through on their ethics, their ideals, and their values. Because on the one hand, Viljar and the youth leadership camp is all about tolerance. It's all about inclusion. It's all about acceptance. It really is a progressive and liberal community, and it sounds like it's for teens whose parents are in politics, and you sort of see with what you know throughout the film that Anders Breivik targeted them because he was a right-wing fanatic, and so he wants to hurt the left-wing or the liberals where he says it'll hurt them most, through their kids. And so on the one hand, you have this teenager and these folks that are preaching tolerance and inclusion. What do you do with those values when you see someone so horrifically oppose you to the means of violence? Do you, in some ways, lose those values and ideals? Do they shatter? How do you move forward with that? And I'll talk about that here in a second. Then you have the lawyer, the attorney. He's assigned to represent the terrorist. It's not his choice. And in some ways, he's faced with that moral and ethical dilemma as well, as how do you represent somebody that you know to be guilty of all these horrific crimes and believe in justice and that everyone deserves a fair trial? And so he's pressed up against his own ideals, and what do you do when you're put in that situation? And then obviously, Anders Breivik, you see to what extremes he'll do to uphold and follow his ideals. So on the one hand, the structure of the film kind of pits these ideological characters and what they represent. But the biggest challenge I have with the film, I think a lot of people will, is that the film devotes so much time to Anders Breivik. And in some ways, we kind of question and worry about, are you giving right-wing fanatics or terrorists a platform to spread their message if you pay so much attention to them? So that in some ways it's a little concerning, because on the one hand I think Paul Greengrass is trying to humanize him in a way that kind of speaks to the audience that anybody can become a domestic terrorist, a right-wing fanatic. And so it really, someone is not born that way. They have to sort of be shaped that way through environment and circumstances. So on the one hand, I think Paul Greengrass may be trying to do that versus completely demonize them to make them less than human, this horrific person that we can't reconcile. And we know that's not necessarily the case, at least not how the director chooses to portray the character in the film. He tends to say he's got an okay to happy relationship with his family. Again, I don't know if that's true or not, but there really seems to be attention to try to humanize him, which for some people could be really disconcerting because of such horrific and inhumane acts that he did. But here's, I think, maybe the one redeeming argument about spending so much time on Anders Breivik, the character in the film, is that most terrorists, most folks that perpetuate, or most folks that follow through with mass shootings, mass killings, they don't survive. They don't survive, and oftentimes that leaves us with post-mortem analysis, trying to piece together motive and reasoning based upon the paper trail of social media posts, of other things about the person that don't oftentimes lead us to real clear, concrete reasons and motives of how this person eventually got to the point where the only way they could express themselves was to gun down and kill dozens of innocent people. And so in the case of Anders Breivik, he survived, and in the film it shows that he makes no efforts to evade capture. As soon as he sees the police sort of surround him on the island, he just very passively gives up and surrenders. And so in a lot of ways it seems like he wanted to get caught again. It kind of creates that tension of, then do we allow him to have this platform in court and in the film to spread his message and his motive? But it also can be very helpful for criminologists and mental health professionals to kind of determine, are there some commonalities in profiling mass shooters? Because most mass shooters, most domestic terrorists, most terrorists don't survive, they don't live, and so we get very little in being able to profile. And that leaves a lot of speculation and hyperbole, and if you watch social media, you'll see that everything from violent video games to being bullying is sort of shown as this sort of trigger or a profiling what a school shooter or a mass shooter might be. And even if there's some element of commonality, that's not enough, that's not sufficient. There are so many people that have deprived upbringings that are bullied, that play violent video games, that never translate into violent people. And so again, we're dealing with a lot of speculation and hypothesis when it comes to what drives a person to commit such atrocious acts against a society. And even if the film is incomplete in that way, I think that attempting to understand Anders Breivik is noble. I just wish it wasn't at the expense of focusing on the recovery and the trauma of the other characters. And especially there's one character named Lara who, she survives the attack, but her younger sister doesn't. And early on in the film, it shows that she, Lara, and the protagonist, Viljar, they kind of have maybe a little bit of a connection. And through his recovery, she pops in and out of the narrative. I would have really appreciated exploring her grief and trauma more, and how she survived and made sense of losing her sister. And even though she had no physical wounds like Viljar, she had a lot more, not a lot more, but the emotional wounds, the loss of her sister, and how she dealt with that. So I do think the film, maybe if there was noble intentions, it kind of misfires by making all of their stories equal and deserving of time, which I'm not sure I would agree with. But again, this film is available on Netflix, so it's free for those of you that have subscriptions or share subscriptions. I won't tell anyone.
Oh, she's stealing! She's stealing!
If you're so inclined, watch this film and tell me what you think about some of the philosophical or ethical dilemma of the structure of the film, the focus on the film, and whether or not you think Paul Greengrass actually accomplishes any of this. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Psych Cinema. Again, tell me what you thought of 22 July. Did you find it harrowing in a positive way, or was it too much or too muddled of a film for you to recommend? You can also leave me a recommendation of any film you would like for me to analyze here on Psych Cinema. Be sure to follow me on Twitter and check out shrinktank.com, where you can find other articles, videos, polls, and more that explore the intersection of pop culture and psychology. That's going to do it for this episode of Psych Cinema. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you soon.